Well, thank you very much. Thank you for that very kind introduction. It's a great pleasure to be at Lafayette College. As just been said, I thought I'd speak for about 15 minutes and then leave as much time as possible for Q&A, argument, disputation, whatever you like. It's a great pleasure to be on an American college campus again. I don't speak very often on campuses here in the US, but I'm always delighted when I do. I think the last time was at Hillary Clinton's alma mater at Wellesley College. Yes, and thank you for bringing that. Yes, this is my fourth book, The Strange Death of Europe. My first, my biography of Alfred Douglas. I flew into Newark to do research for in 1997, 1998, something like that, and just before going up to Oxford. And I've written about this publicly before, but among the people I saw on that first visit of mine to the US were Mr. and Mrs. Trump Sr. Thus, because the subject of the book I was researching was on Lord Alfred Douglas, making me, I think, probably the only person who is able to make the connection between Oscar Wilde and Donald Trump, and not an obvious link. But anyhow, I've written on a number of subjects since that first book on literature, and written on the war in Northern Ireland, a book on Bloody Sunday. And this, in a way, is not an obvious follow-on work. My now late agent used to say to me that the point of authors was that you were meant to get an audience, get them to stick with you, do another book, get them to stick with you, grow the audience, and so on. And he said to me that I had an uncanny knack of getting an audience and then throwing them off by doing something on a subject so unlike the previous one that nobody but a maniac would have all four of my books by this point. So, but if there is anything that they have in common, it tends to be that I'm interested in. And by the way, as I say, I genuinely am willing to talk about it, whatever you like in the Q&A, and including anything that can be practically helpful, because I know at the stage of life that most of you are at, one has practical questions as well as philosophical ones. But one of the few things that all of my work so far does have in common is that it tends to be about subjects which are sort of somehow not known about, or difficult subjects which I've had to sort of tease and find out the facts in. Sort of areas where, the sort of areas that you sort of think you probably shouldn't tread into, which for a certain type of person, of which I'm one unfortunately, that's a great invitation to then tread on in. And the other thing, I suppose, is that all of them are subjects which I started off with a sort of view of what I thought would happen, and by the end have tried as much as possible to challenge the views I've gone in with, and have come out with some different views. The point being that as a writer, in my view, the only thing you can do is to show the truth as you see it. When I was writing my book on Bloody Sunday, the worst day in the Troubles in Northern Ireland, there was one fact in particular in the book that was deeply, deeply upsetting for any reader. And I remember saying to a historian friend of mine in Ireland, you know, I sort of feel I have to say this. It's fundamental, but I don't know if the readers are going to want this or not. And she replied with beautifully, she said, Douglas, all we can do is tell the truth. And I think that is the case for a writer. Otherwise, there are plenty of other better enumerated roles you can take in life. But this book, The Strange Death of Europe, is about something which has been going on, in my view, for decades, but which has a focal point, and the focal point is in 2015. And it had to do with something that specifically happened in the summer of that year. Now, I can't go over all of the historical processes that began from the post-war period onwards in Europe that I describe in the book. But as a journalist, I was, by 2015, I'd already for some years been going to, firstly, the countries that people were fleeing from and often coming to Europe. Countries in Africa, Middle East, Far East, and so on. And then in 2015 in particular was going to the places that people were arriving in Europe, that is the Italian islands, the Greek islands, most prominently, In 2015, the movement massively ratcheted up. And as I say, as a journalist, I was going and writing from individual places, and it became clear to me that it wasn't possible in 1,000 words or 1,500 words to write about the entirety of this. And the specific thing that gripped me and made me think I just have to write this as a book was standing on the Italian island of Lampedusa one day. This is an island almost exactly equidistant between Sicily and the North African coastline. And it's become well known in recent years as one of the largest areas that people arrive into and to get into Europe. And obviously among the terrible human scenes that were there, as everywhere during the crisis and since, I found myself doing what I realized that my fellow Europeans were doing, which was dreaming dreams about this. You stand on an island where some days the same number of people as live on Lampedusa, which is about 5,000. Some days that number of people would arrive in a single day on the island. And early on in the crisis, the authorities started to realize this was a problem for all sorts of reasons. The locals, by the way, in Lampedusa, like on the Greek islands, are very welcoming by and large. Then they help, they assist, they had aid, they had charity from the very beginning of this crisis. But what I realized was that you could stand on an island like that and dream dreams, as it were, about what would happen. And I found myself doing it one day, and that's why I realized I needed to write a book about the whole thing. Because you can stand in a place like that and you think, I know what. Why does we can cope with this. This group could go to Milan, and this group could maybe go to Sweden, and the next days could go to somewhere else, and this. And this, I realized, was precisely what the authorities were dreaming. And what I realized was, among other things, an intimation of something I had already known from traveling across Europe, which was that this was not the end of a story. It was the beginning of one, and the beginning of one for Europe. And specifically, the unpleasant and painful realization that the people coming in by the summer of 2015 by their thousands were not going to have the life that they had dreamt of when they paid the smugglers to get them onto the routes in the first place, but were going to be met again by me and others sleeping rough outside a train station in Milan, for instance, working for a gang in the marketplace in Rome, trying to get through the pass into Austria, selling counterfeit goods on a street in Norway. And it became clear to me that what was happening was not only ungoverned, but very, very unthought through. So I decided to try to describe what I see as being the most significant thing to happen in my lifetime in Europe, the most significant events post-war, and to try to explain not just the facts, the day-to-day facts of what this meant, but the underlying philosophical reasons, among others, why it should have come to be. Just to give you a couple of the facts, though, in 2015, by the summer of 2015, the last day of August 2015 is the day when Angela Merkel announces basically unilaterally that Germany will no longer enforce its borders and its normal asylum procedures. And that's the point at which the massive movement of people that was already moving into Europe sped up exponentially. One of the things that's most interesting about it to me was how little of the practical detail my fellow Europeans wanted to know about. For instance, the Merkel government talked about it as if the main flow was a Syrian refugee issue, which part of it certainly is, people fleeing the brutal civil war in Syria. But you also noticed, just again by going to any of the entry points, that it was a veritable United Nations of people arriving. People from all across North Africa, all of sub-Saharan Africa, almost every country in the Middle East, the Far East, people from Bangladesh, from Pakistan, from countries that were at war and countries that weren't. And what Merkel did in that moment was something which the rest of Europe has still not been able to forgive her for or been able to cope with. Something fascinating happened only a few months later in 2016, when the Vice President of the European Commission, a man called Frans Timmermans, said that by the EU's own figures, among the people who arrived in 2015, which was a year in which, in a single year alone, Germany and Sweden both added between 2 and 3% of the population in a year. During that year, it turned out that by the EU's own figures, Frans Timmermans said that at least 60% of the arrivals in 2015 had, quote, no more right to be in Europe than anyone else in the rest of the world. And the problem about this is that anyone like me who had traveled and spoken to people arriving could work this out for themselves. There are terrible, terrible stories that I heard firsthand from, as I say, an unbelievable array of places. But that also a lot of this was an economic migration, which had, for understandable reasons, taken advantage of the changing of the border situation to go into Europe. To say that these events are going to have follow-on, knock-on effects for a long time to come is to state the absolutely obvious, because the effects, the knock-on effects, can already be seen. They've already been seen in elections in the Netherlands, in elections in France, in the German elections, where a party that's only existed for 4 years now sits in the Bundestag as the third largest party. I'm talking about the Alternative for Deutschland party. And where the new Austrian Prime Minister has basically only got into power by the large percentage that he has because of these events. There are masses and masses of things to say about the specifics, as I say, about what actually happened, the numbers, the details, a lot of things that a lot of Europeans don't want to know about, and particularly European leaders. But in a way, what interested me more about it was the underlying reasons why this was going on, and the underlying consequences that it might have in the future. Because it's actually quite an unusual position to get yourself into as a continent or as a country. To get yourself into a position where you don't think that your external borders need any policing. And I say that this is something which goes through the heart of everyone, not just in Europe, but everybody in the world. We all know the problems of this. We all know the personal and philosophical challenges we all go through when trying to think about this issue. Who should come into a country? How many people can a country take? What are the limits? Are there some people you don't want to take? Are there some places you want to be wary about taking people from? What happens when people are in, then do something they shouldn't? What do you do with them?